I'm Kevin Mims with the Invading Sea, a Florida-wide media collaborative that reports on climate change in the state. As part of that effort, we've started The Business of Climate Change, a weekly interview with businessmen and women whose companies are either affected by the warming climate or address climate challenges. Today's conversation is with Peter Moore, President and CEO of Chen Moore & Associates, a civil engineering, landscape architecture, and planning firm based in Fort Lauderdale. Peter, thanks for talking with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
So, Peter, you work in South Florida and your firm has offices throughout the state. What climate-related changes have you seen during your career in South Florida and elsewhere?
Sure. I think before I even started my career, I was born in South Florida. I was born right here in Broward County. I can tell you how much my neighborhood flooded when Hurricane David came through in the late 70s. So I think it's important to have that context when you're dealing with localized problems. I can tell you right now that the catch basins, those drains that sit out in front of people's houses, when I was a child, the water really didn't come up through the grates during king tides, and they really do now. But really, as you mentioned, talking about climate change and talking about sea level rise, this is kind of inside baseball to myself as a civil engineer. I've got a couple of degrees in civil engineering from the University of Florida. And, so I spent most of my career dealing with this. At a very early age, I learned in my career, I learned about the interaction between groundwater and surface water. So I knew that, honestly, just as simple as water goes downhill, you knew that if the source of water, where your water was going, kept rising because the seas are rising, it's going to be much more difficult to drain the properties that we have here. We have a very efficient system in South Florida, but obviously we're still fighting elevation against the seas. The only other thing that I can see, as far as that goes, we've done some work in Latin America and in the Caribbean. Everyone is studying the idea that the intensity of storms is changing. And so that's requiring more and more mechanical solutions like pumps, as opposed to more and more passive systems like overflow weirs or just canals that drain to an ocean.
Peter, what role do civil engineers and planners play in addressing climate challenges?
Sure. What I like to say is that we're leading from behind. The policymakers really and truly set, the policies that happen. The regulators set a lot of those things. And, my goal as a civil engineer is to balance the public safety, health, and welfare versus all of the various regulatory challenges that we face, while still trying to make a cost-effective product for my clients. We mostly work for government. We're probably a 70-30 split. So for the most part, working for the government, we always have the public safety in mind. I really think that a lot of what we do is we design and we're evaluating fixes for these problems, and we're on the front lines. We've done a great amount of work in the city of Miami Beach, as an example. They had a pilot project where they were starting to raise some of their roads, and they were starting to by 2 or 3 feet. And then the funny thing is, it's really easy to raise a road. It's really easy to figure out how to drain that road once you raise it. What's really difficult is the harmonization with the neighborhoods. And so if you were a neighbor in these particular neighborhoods in Miami Beach, let's face it, they were $5 to $10 million homes, that, it's possible that we were back pitching their driveway towards the house. So now all of a sudden you've just spent, 7 or 8 figures on a home that all of a sudden floods every time it rains. So catching that water and making sure that we did the proper harmonization is always going to be critical to what we do in a stormwater sense.
So, Peter, what are some of the biggest challenges for civil engineers in Florida with regard to climate change?
Sure, there's a whole lot of them. Really, I think, the first thing that I think, and it's funny, I was actually just having this conversation at lunch today. I think this, the South Florida Climate Change Compact did a fantastic job of establishing certain levels and establishing that baseline sea level rise protection. Because honestly, one of the most difficult things as a civil engineer is to know is, what am I really facing, and what am I really going to be facing in 50, 60, or 70 years? Because that's the life of some of the infrastructure that we design. And so, if we're thinking that the seas are going to be up by 2 feet, that's very different than thinking the seas are going to be up by 6 feet. And so we would have totally different approaches to those. So while the Climate Change Compact has done a great job, I do know that there's other municipalities, there's other agencies that are looking to have even more resiliency built in. There's a term in my industry called freeboard, and that's that little bit of extra above what's required by the regulatory authorities. And so, how much freeboard do you build in? I had a friend who is an engineer, he's a structural engineer. but he called me up and he said, "Hey, I'm totally tearing this house down to the slab. How much should I raise the slab by?" And I looked at the FEMA maps and I went through and did all that stuff. And I said, honestly, if you raise it by 1 foot, you'll meet every projected every projected issue that FEMA is ever going to come up with. But how much more is it to raise at 18 inches? How much more is it to raise at 24 inches? If you can raise, I hate to sound so arbitrary about it, but there's so many things about sea level rise that we don't necessarily know yet that could potentially be something that's a game changer for us. And so, again, just preparing for that little bit extra is really important. I think one of the other things that's been really challenging for us is a lot of the work that we do is based off of the National Weather Society, NOAA maps from the 1960s. And so the intensity curves where we take a look at how fast the rain is coming, because it's not always just about how much. We're the stormwater master planners for Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport, as an example. We did their last 2 master plans. They had a situation in which so much rain came down in 3 hours last December, not this past December, but December before, that the airport ended up having to shut down. Now, if you were to look at it based on the maps that we typically work off of, which are 24-hour increments and stuff like that, that wasn't too much rain to cause a flood. But if all that water comes in 3 hours or 2 hours or even 1 hour, then obviously the intensity and the ability for that system to absorb that water becomes impacted. So dealing with the increase in intensity in storms is also very difficult. There's 2 other things that are really hard to do. One is, trying to talk about the change of the pace of change and what's going on here. No, if the water goes up 1 inch, it's not that big of a deal this year. And if it goes up by 3 inches over 10 years, it's hard to see that. And so sometimes you really need those extreme events in order to remind people, hey man, remember your house almost flooded last year or 4 years ago or 10 years ago? Yeah, those are the sort of things that I worry about in my world, because, I worry about storms that are supposed to happen once every 100 years, once every 500 years. It's pretty wild to think about the fact that I design for things that may not happen in my own lifetime. But that's because we have to design according to those standards. And the very, very last thing that makes it difficult for civil engineers in Florida is I really think the people that really hold the keys to the car are the insurance companies and the banks, because it's the day in which you have a $2 billion building that won't get reinsured, or the day in which you're looking to do a $500 million development, you can't secure that mezzanine financing for your build. That's when people are really going to jump up and realize, oh my goodness, we have a real issue here. So all the incremental fixes that I do are all fine. And, we're not going to all of a sudden build a 35-foot wall around the state of Florida just to make sure that we're okay. But every one of those incremental little projects has a little bit of impact on what you're doing. And when your neighbor builds his house a little bit higher, that impacts your property just a tiny little bit. And it's really the straw that broke the camel's back. And when that one development or that one project that we all thought was going to happen and is going to be a great moneymaker for someone can't occur.
Peter, what should Florida communities be doing now to better protect themselves from the effects of sea level rise and climate change?
So I think that the first thing that everyone needs to do is to get as educated as possible. I think things have been doing a great, our state is seeing an absolute, pardon the pun, sea change in the opinion about the fact that sea level rise is happening. And I think that, some recent policy developments have shown some great initiatives moving forward. And it's not just in the state of Florida. Same thing happens in New York. New York has a ton of property, Louisiana, the Outer Banks. We're all in this together as far as sea level rise goes. And it's funny too, because when I start talking about education, a lot of it comes down to the fact that I have to talk to the cities that are on the western boundary of Broward County. And I say to them, and they don't think about sea level rise. They say, oh, we're all the way out west. And there's something out there. There's the big berm or the big hill that you see out there that separates the Everglades. It's called the East Coast Protective Levee. What's interesting in Broward County is that all that water from the Everglades eventually ends up going to Florida Bay. And so Florida Bay ends up rising by a foot or two. All the water in this area of Florida, it's called Water Conservation Area 2, rises. Then something very special happens when water rises on one side of an earthen structure like that, is water seeps underneath and increases the groundwater elevations in the western communities too. So sometimes, you have to sit down there and talk to the communities in the western areas and say, sea level rise affects all of us, not just because it's coming up the canals, but it's also coming at us from the west side, particularly here in South Florida. I think that House Bill 53 this past year that talks about needing to develop a 20-year needs assessment analysis is incredibly important because that means that every single city is going to have at least some idea of what is going on. It involves water, wastewater, and stormwater, but since we're talking about stormwater here, it's some idea of a plan to move forward over the next 20 years. Most of the clients that we work with are very, very forward thinking. I don't want anyone to think the government's just been sitting on its hands. There are some fantastic resiliency plans. There are some fantastic stormwater visioning plans that have come out. There are some really unique solutions that are coming out. But this forces everyone to be on a level playing field and to take a look at what that 20-year needs analysis is going to do.
Peter, you just mentioned a House bill. What can Florida legislatures do to help?
Sure. As I said before, I think the first thing that they needed to do was recognize that there was a problem and identify that there was a problem and have that conversation in the open, in the sunshine, with Sunshine State, about the fact that the seas were actually rising. I think between all the hard work that's been done by the South Florida Climate Change Compact, locally in Broward County, Dr. Gerardo leading that, I think there's some great things that have come out of these open discussions that have been having. The next thing, and I hate to say, throw money at a problem, but really and truly, we need funding. We need funding for better studies. We need to continue to study what used to be the Central and South Florida Flood Control District. We're trying to get money from the feds in order for them to do a restudy of that entire system, basically the entire plumbing of South Florida as far as the stormwater system goes. Unfortunately, that got cut out of the national budget for the Army Corps last year, but we're looking to try to get a Project New Start so we can just get some just $2 in there, gets the whole process starting to move, and then we can work on getting the appropriations later. So that's a huge deal because really, the primary canal system for South Florida in the South Florida Water Management District is the tailwater condition. It's the water that all the water goes into for almost every municipality. Last but not least, I really think that municipalities, local governments really need to, and Florida legislators in general, need to take a look at our adaptive plans. So it may not be a hard and fast, build all your seawalls walls to elevation 7 and make sure that every street doesn't flood if you get 15 inches of rain in 2 hours. I think it's going to need to be something that adapts over time. I think that we're going to need to establish knowing that there's a moving boundary, knowing that the seas are changing at a certain pace. And there probably need to be things that have certain trigger points. Right now, as an example, Broward County has adopted new groundwater elevations for all new developments or substantial redevelopments. And in some cases, it's absolutely fantastic, but in some cases, we might not see these impacts for 20 or 30 years. And so maybe there needs to be a break point in there where we say, hey, these maps work this way until we see X amount of groundwater rise, and then they're going to start working Y way once that sort of thing happens. Now, I understand when you're building a building, it's not like you're going to jack it up in the air after a certain amount of time. So having that really long time planning horizon is important. But what we balance not only water quantity, the amount of water that sits there. We also monitor and manage how long it takes to drain. So if you have a really, really, really bad rainstorm, first of all, there's a 1 in 3 chance that it happens while you're asleep. And if that water goes away in 2 or 3 hours, particularly while you're asleep, it's not that impactful. But the duration of flooding is something that's really, really important to us. So we use fancy engineering words, intensity and duration, but it's really important to note that we have to manage both of those. And even more difficult is the fact that our original flood system was designed very, very well to get water away as quickly as possible. That also takes every pollutant we possibly have and puts it into our surface water system, pollutes our oceans. We made such a huge deal about closing our ocean outfalls for our wastewater plants in South Florida when 1,000 times more nutrients are washed off into our canal systems every day when there's a rainstorm. So, we need to be very, very, very purposeful when it comes to looking at those elements.
Peter, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Anytime we can ever help, engineers we spend our entire careers helping people. So please let me know how else we can help.